In March 2026, Iran closed the Strait of Hormuz in retaliation for the killing of their leader, Ali Khamenei. Oil hit $100 a barrel. The news call it a geopolitical crisis. Politicians call it aggression. But they're all describing the symptom, not the disease. There is something in that strait that isn't on any map. Something that connects the gasoline in your car to a palace in Riyadh. Something that links the price of your groceries to a deal made in secret 50 years ago. It is also the reason why the United States, despite being self-sufficient in oil since the Shale Revolution, cannot give up on the Middle East, and why the survival of the American economic model depends entirely on the outcome of this conflict with Iran. This thing is called Petrodollar. This is the story of its birth and its death. And most importantly, how it will directly impact your life in the coming decades. By 1967, tensions between Israel and its Arab neighbors were at a boiling point. Syrian-backed Palestinian guerrillas were staging attacks across Israel's northern border. Israel answered by shooting down 6 Syrian MiG fighter jets, escalating the conflict further. To make things worse, the Soviet Union falsely warned Egypt that Israel was massing troops on the Syrian border for an invasion. Egyptian President Gamal Abdel Nasser, under pressure to support Syria, then took 3 dramatic steps that made war all but inevitable. He positioned troops in the Sinai Peninsula close to Israel's border. He expelled the UN emergency force that had kept peace there since 1956. And he closed the Strait of Tiran to Israeli shipping, blocking the country's only access to the Red Sea. Jordan and Iraq joined the alliance, and Arab rhetoric grew increasingly aggressive. Israel felt existential threats from all sides and decided a preemptive strike was its only option. On the morning of June 5, 1967, Israeli jets flew low over the Mediterranean to avoid radar detection, then swooped in from the north and attacked Egypt. Within hours, they destroyed over 90% of Egypt's air force still on the ground, obliterating more than 300 aircraft. They then decimated the air forces of Jordan, Syria, and Iraq. With total air superiority secured, the ground war began immediately. Israeli tanks and infantry stormed into the Sinai Peninsula and Gaza Strip. By June 8, they had reached the Suez Canal, captured the entire Sinai. Jordan ignored Israeli warnings to stay out and began shelling West Jerusalem. On June 7, Israeli paratroopers captured East Jerusalem and the Old City, including the Western Wall. The entire West Bank fell under Israeli control. On June 9, after a brief lull, Israeli assaulted the heavily fortified Golan Heights. By June 10, they had captured the strategic plateau, arriving within 40 kilometers of Damascus, until a UN-brokered ceasefire took effect. By the end of the conflict, Israel had tripled in size, while the Arab states had lost Sinai, Gaza, the West Bank, East Jerusalem, and the Golan Heights. For the Arab world, the results were catastrophic. In August 1967, Arab leaders met in Khartoum, Sudan, and issued the famous 3 no's: no peace with Israel, no recognition of Israel, no negotiation with Israel. It was a declaration of permanent defiance. The defeat left a burning desire for revenge that would culminate with the Yom Kippur War in 1973. Only this time, the battlefield wouldn't be just in Sinai or Golan, but in every gas station in America. 6 years have passed since the humiliation of 1967. Egypt's President Anwar Sadat, who succeeded Nasser after his death in 1970, was determined to reclaim Arab honor. But he knew something his predecessors hadn't fully grasped. A military victory was impossible. Israel was too strong, too entrenched, too well armed by the United States. So Sadat devised a different strategy. The goal wasn't necessarily to win territorially. It was to shake the world's confidence in Israel's invincibility, and most importantly, to force the superpowers to intervene. If Egypt could inflict enough pain, maybe the world would start taking the Arab cause more seriously. And this time, they had a secret weapon. On October 6, 1973, the holiest day in the Jewish calendar, Yom Kippur, Egypt and Syria launched a coordinated surprise attack. Egypt crossed the Suez Canal into Israeli-occupied Sinai, while Syria stormed the Golan Heights. The timing was brilliant. Israel's military was partially shut down for a holiday. Soldiers were at home with their families. Reservists were slow to mobilize. In the first 48 hours, the Arab armies achieved what had seemed impossible. They broke through Israeli lines. Egyptian forces crossed the Suez Canal and overwhelmed the heavily fortified Bar-Lev line. Syrian tanks nearly reached the Jordan River, threatening to slice Israel in half. For the first time since 1948, Israel faced a genuine existential threat. But Israel recovered. Within days, reserves mobilized and the tide began to turn. Fierce tank battles took place in the Golan Heights. Israel managed to push the Syrians back to the pre-1967 lines. In Sinai, Israeli forces under Ariel Sharon found a gap between two Egyptian armies, crossed the Suez Canal, and encircled Egypt's Third Army. By the second week, Israel was again on the offensive, and Egypt's trapped Third Army faced annihilation. But this time something else was happening, something far beyond the battlefield. While the war raged, the Arab oil-producing states executed their true strategy. On October 17, 1973, OPEC announced an oil embargo against countries supporting Israel. The primary targets, the United States and the Netherlands, the gateway of the European oil. The consequences were devastating. Global supply tightened, panic buying spiraled prices, and gas stations ran dry, with lines stretched for blocks. It was total economic chaos, and everyone was affected. By December, oil prices had quadrupled, from around $3 per barrel to nearly $12. I know, the good old days when a barrel would cost $3 or $12 instead of $100. Little did we know. For the first time, the Arab world had found a weapon that didn't require winning a war. They didn't need to defeat Israeli tanks, they just needed to make the West feel the pain. They needed to punish them through something they depended on: energy. This event became known as the 1973 oil shock and is a classic case of asymmetric warfare. When you face your enemy in areas beyond the purely military, the art of war at its finest. What were the results? The United States came under immense public pressure and had to intervene to de-escalate the conflict. It then made demands on the Israelis, threatening to cut off support. Israel was forced to sign disengagement agreements with Egypt and Syria in 1974. Israeli forces pulled back from some territory captured in 1973 and even made some small withdrawals from 1967 conquests. The surprise attack also shattered the image of Israel's military supremacy, and the war triggered UN Resolution 338, calling for an immediate ceasefire and implementation of Resolution 242. For the first time, Israel faced unified international pressure to negotiate. After all, everybody needs oil, right? But the United States saw an opportunity in that crisis, something that could solve another problem they were facing since the end of the Vietnam War. To understand all this, we must go back to July 1944, to a conference held at the Mount Washington Hotel in Bretton Woods, New Hampshire. World War II was still far from over, but after the successful Normandy landings and the overwhelming advance of Operation Bagration, the Soviet offensive that destroyed Germany's Army Group Center, the mood among the Allies was one of optimism. In this context, the major powers of the bloc and many other nations gathered at this hotel to decide what the post-war world would look like, especially the economy. From this hotel meeting, the International Monetary Fund and the International Bank for Reconstruction and Development, IBRD, now part of the World Bank, were born. The Bretton Woods agreements also established that the US currency would be backed by gold at $35 per ounce, and that all other currencies would be linked to the dollar. In practice, this made the dollar the international reserve currency,
which represented a great responsibility to the United States, but also guaranteed some privileges, exorbitant privileges, or as the French called it, l'exorbitant privilege, or something like that. Okay, this is a complex topic that deserves its own video, but to put it briefly,
countries needed the stability of the dollar to mediate trade between themselves. The problem is that only the United States could issue the currency.
In practice, this allowed the United States to issue a lot of money without suffering the consequences that much, since the inflation generated by this excessive issuance of money would not be absorbed totally by the United States, but rather by the countries that needed the dollar.
At one point, the French were unhappy with the system, and President Charles de Gaulle and his finance minister, Valéry Giscard d'Estaing, or something like that, they began to actively criticize this privilege. Remember, by the late 1960s, the Vietnam War had become a financial black hole. Conservative estimates put the cost at $200 billion by 1971. That's roughly $1.5 trillion in today's money, when adjusted for inflation. The US was printing money like there was no tomorrow to fund both the war and Lyndon B. Johnson's Great Society domestic programs.
But by 1971, the US had flooded the world with so many dollars that foreign nations started questioning whether the United States really had gold to back all these dollars in circulation.
The French then led a movement against this exorbitant privilege, demanding the repatriation of their gold and returning their dollars to the Americans.
In other words, they wanted the ballast, not the paper.
After much resistance, the Americans gave in and the French escorted their gold back to France on ships. Fearing that other countries would follow suit, and taking into account the costs of the war, Americans decided to take drastic action at once. On August 15, 1971, on a Sunday night, interrupting a popular TV show, President Richard Nixon announced that the United States was unilaterally severing the dollar's link to gold.
We must protect the position of the American dollar as a pillar of monetary stability around the world. We will press for the necessary reforms to set up an urgently needed new international monetary system. I have directed Secretary Connally to suspend temporarily the convertibility of the dollar into gold or other reserve assets. The convertibility of the dollar into gold.
The Bretton Woods system was dead. The dollar was now a pure fiat currency, backed by nothing but the full faith and credit of the US government. But that faith had already been shaken in the previous decade by Vietnam, by inflation, by the French sailing away with their gold. Remember, this was 1971. The Yom Kippur War and the oil shock would only happen a few years later. During this period, Americans were still haunted by the possibility that the dollar would lose its relevance in the world and undermine the exorbitant privilege. They needed an alternative. The energy crisis showed them the way. Now let's go back to the oil shock of 1973. During the negotiations, Americans established a line of communication and strengthened relations with Arab nations.
At that time, the Saudi royal family was deeply concerned about the advance of Soviet influence in the region, which they viewed as an existential threat. Recognizing this, the US Treasury Secretary William E. Simon engineered one of the most ingenious economic systems in history, a plan that only someone with a profound grasp of the nature of money could have conceived. President Nixon and Secretary of State Henry Kissinger then operationalized this vision, presenting the Saudis with an irresistible strategic bargain. The Americans offered military protection, weapons, and intelligence cooperation to the Saudi royal family. In exchange, the Saudis would trade their oil exclusively in dollars and reinvest a portion of that money in the US by purchasing US Treasury bonds, effectively lending America its own money back at interest. It was advantageous for both parties. The Arabs would have the protection they so desperately needed, in addition to profiting along the way. The Americans, on the other hand, would benefit from the sale of the bonds, which would help finance their deficit and keep interest rates low, as well as tighten the ties between the economies of both countries and ensure that their interests remained aligned. But most importantly, the agreement had given new life to the exorbitant privilege.
Remember, the world had lost interest in the dollar since the end of the gold standard. There was a certain crisis of confidence. However, by establishing that the world's oil would now be traded in dollars, the Americans ensured that the currency would stay relevant since everybody needs oil. And that's what we call the petrodollar. You see how brilliant this is?
With this move, they achieved an even better system than Bretton Woods. Now the Americans would no longer have the responsibility of keeping their currency pegged at $35 per ounce. They could print as much money as they wanted, and the world would be forced to bear the cost, since everyone needs oil. So whether you like them or not, Simon, Nixon, and Kissinger are the true architects of American wealth over the past 50 years. If the dollar still has any relevance today and Americans have a relatively good standard of living and the largest and most expensive armed forces in the world, it is mainly due to this agreement. So if you're an American and think your standard of living isn't good, believe me, you'd be paying much more for your groceries if it weren't for the petrodollar. Inflation would be 1,000 times worse.
An important note here. You may have noticed that the petrodollar is not a currency or a backing like gold or silver. It is a system, a mechanism created to maintain global demand for dollars and allow the exorbitant privilege to function. It is the magical printer that people often joke about. A private, unlimited ATM. Who wouldn't want something like that? The system worked as intended for decades. The Saudis got their protection, the Americans got their exorbitant privilege, everyone benefited. Until the Shale Revolution.
For most of our oil history, we drilled into porous rock where oil had pooled over millions of years, easy to extract like water from a sponge. But shale is different. Shale is the source rock, the place where oil was born but never escaped. It's like oil trapped inside solid concrete. For decades it was inaccessible. Then came two innovations, horizontal drilling and hydraulic fracturing fracking. Imagine drilling a well straight down, then turning sideways for a mile or more through the shale, then pumping water, sand, and chemicals at insane pressure to crack the rock open. The oil flows out.
I know it's complex, I don't fully get it either. But basically, the Americans figured out how to extract oil from the rocks. And they had a lot of these rocks.
By 2014, engineers had turned the impossible into reality. Shale revolutionized the global oil market. In 2018, the United States became the world's largest oil producer, pumping more than Saudi Arabia and Russia.
Make no mistake, the shale revolution turned the United States into the world's largest oil producer. This was vital to meet domestic demand and shield the American market from geopolitical shocks. However, production isn't everything. The US still needs the world to keep buying energy in dollars. Remember, the petrodollar isn't just about oil. It's all about exorbitant privilege. That is the linchpin of this entire system, and if you grasp this concept, you understand why the petrodollar remains the ultimate global power play.
Okay, so for the first time, Americans no longer depended on the Middle East to meet their domestic demand, but this left some hard feelings.
Put yourself in the Arab shoes. For decades, they had honored their agreement and been loyal to the Americans. Now, suddenly they felt discarded and betrayed. First, because Americans did not depend on them anymore, and the relation that was essential became optional. Second, because the Americans were now competing directly with the Saudi Arabians in the global oil market. Why should they continue selling in dollars after this blow to confidence?
As if that weren't enough, another incident would further sour the relationship between them. In 2018, Jamal Khashoggi, a Washington Post columnist and critic of the Saudi regime, walked into the Saudi consulate in Istanbul.
He never walked out. Okay, I'm not going into details here, you can do your own search later if you want. Later, stay here in this video. But basically something very seriously happened to Khashoggi, and the Americans started leveling accusations against their former allies. Congress wanted to punish Saudi Arabia. Biden administration released intelligence report implicating Prince Mohammed bin Salman. Saudi Arabia realized, democratic presidents will turn on us. We need hedges. On September 14, 2019, the world woke to news that something unprecedented had happened. In the early morning hours, a swarm of drones and cruise missiles struck Saudi Arabia's oil infrastructure. The Target: Abqaiq Processing Facility,
the world's largest crude oil stabilization plant that processed 7 million barrels per day, about 7% of global supply, and Kurai's oil field, a major production facility 150 miles away. The attack initially knocked out 5.7 million barrels per day, roughly 50% of Saudi production and 6% of the world's total oil supply. It was the largest single disruption in oil history. Oil prices spiked immediately. Brent crude jumped from $60 to $69 per barrel.
The world held its breath.
Although Yemen's Houthis rebels had quickly claimed the responsibility, the perpetrator of the attack was still unclear. Many believed that the attack had originated from north-northwest, not south, from Yemen. So who else could be suspected of the attack? Iran, of course.
An unprovoked attack? Not really. Let's give you a little bit of context. This was 2019. The US had just withdrew from the nuclear deal with Iran on May 2018. Trump pulled out of the JCPOA and reimposed crippling sanctions against Iran, aiming to choke Iran's oil exports to zero, strangling its economy. By September 2019, Iran was feeling the squeezy and looking for a way to signal that this maximal pressure would be paid by everyone. It was a way of saying, if you can strangle our oil exports, we can strangle everyone's. Do you see how we are reaching the present moment? But back to the Arabs. How did they feel about this attack? This is the turning point.
At the time, President Trump tweeted that the US was locked and loaded and waiting to hear from Saudi Arabia. But then he suggested at one point that the ultimate responsibility in dealing with the attacks rested with Saudi Arabia. That was an attack on Saudi Arabia and that wasn't an attack on us, Trump said on September 16th. But we would certainly help them.
The help that came was modest. 3,000 additional US troops and some beefed up Saudi air defenses. No direct retaliation against Iran. No Tomahawk missiles. No airstrikes. The message was unmistakable. America wouldn't go to war for Saudi oil. How did the Saudis interpret this event? Our supposed protectors just showed us we are on our own. You see how everything is connected? It's beautiful. So, Saudi Arabia was no longer content to act like a passive client state and start to pursue an Saudi's first foreign policy, prioritizing regime stability and economic diversification instead of traditional alliance loyalty.
After decades of relying almost exclusively on the US, Saudi Arabia began actively diversifying its partnerships. This wasn't an impulsive divorce from Washington. It was a calculated strategy scholars call strategic hedging.
You know, don't put all your eggs in the same basket. If the basket falls, you'll be left with nothing.
In 2016, Saudi Arabia and Russia ended decades of rivalry and began coordinating oil production. By 2019, they had formalized this partnership into something called OPEC+, a grouping that now manages the global oil market. OPEC's Secretary General called it a Catholic marriage, meant to last for eternity. The relationship has proven resilient. In 2022, when the Biden administration begged Saudi Arabia to increase production and lower gas prices, which would have hurt Russia's war finances and helping in the American midterms,
Riyadh chose to cut production instead. A clear message. Saudi Arabia's interests come first. And then there is China.
China is now Saudi Arabia's largest trading partner and biggest oil customer. When the US refused to sell armored drones and missile technology, China stepped in.
And in 2023, I don't know if you remember, China pulled off something the United States couldn't.
It brokered a diplomatic reconciliation between Saudi Arabia and Iran, two regional rivals who had been at odds for decades.
The deal was signed in Beijing, not Washington. The message was unmistakable. Saudi Arabia was not abandoning America, but it was no longer exclusively America's partner.
As one analyst put it, Riyadh is now playing a game of strategic hedging, keeping ties with everyone, committing fully to no one, and making sure its own interest always comes first.
That's how a sovereign country must behave. And that brings us to today.
On February 28, 2026, the world changed. After months of escalated tensions over Iran's nuclear program, the United States and Israel launched coordinated strikes targeting the heart of Iran's leadership. Operation Epic Fury and Operation Lion's Roar sent stealth bombers, fighter jets, and cruise missiles into Tehran and other strategic sites, with the aim of promoting a regime change in the country and establishing a new leadership, more aligned with American and Israeli interests.
The primary target?
Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, Iran's supreme leader for over 3 decades. He was killed in the strikes, but the operation's legacy will be stained by something else. Among the over 1,200 casualties were more than 150 schoolgirls.
Children killed in a strike that was supposed to target something entirely different.
The images spread across social media. The grief turned to rage. And in Tehran, the response was being planned even as the smoke rose. The thing is that the planners in Washington and Tel Aviv made a critical miscalculation. They assumed that decapitating the regime would cause it to collapse. They forgot something fundamental about the Islamic Republic. It was never just about one man.
It's a state with institutionalized secession. Iran has spent decades ensuring that its policies outlives their leaders. In other words, they have a complex, decentralized system capable to remain operational even without its leadership. And that's exactly what happened.
Almost immediately after the attacks, even with the death of the supreme leader and his potential successors, the Iranians began to retaliate. Hundreds of missiles and drones were launched against Israel and US bases in the Middle East, and the Strait of Hormuz was closed.
The regime change that some hoped for, it never came.
For decades, Iran has been preparing for this conflict, which it considered inevitable. They knew they lacked the capacity to confront a military giant like the United States head-on, and so they developed strategies for asymmetric warfare. One of its leading strategists, General Soleimani, had developed a network known as the Axis of Resistance, which included Hamas, Hezbollah, and the Houthis of Yemen. For Iran, this was a way to encircle and pressure Israel, military and economically.
You probably remember when the Houthis started attacking ships in the Red Sea with the aim of damaging Israel's economy, right? On the other hand, Iran knew it was impossible to take on the colossal US Air Force and Navy.
Especially since its aircraft were in disrepair over decades of sanctions. That's when they adopted the doctrine of missiles and drones, ones that were cheap, efficient, easy to transport, and could be mass-produced.
Why was that brilliant? Pay attention to this.
When a missile or drone attacks a facility or ship, the target uses some kind of interception system to defend itself, such as Phalanx machine guns, Patriot missiles, or Israel's famous Iron Dome. So, when the missile or drone approaches, it is intercepted and the ship or facility remains safe.
But what happens when the enemy has more missiles than you do? Exactly. You become vulnerable.
If the enemy launches 100 missiles and you only have 10 to shoot them down, the other 90 will potentially hit you, now that your defense capabilities have been compromised.
That is what we call saturation warfare. Why is this a problem to the US and its allies? 3 reasons: cost, scale, and supply chains.
You see, American equipment is generally very expensive, complex, and time-consuming to produce. By way of comparison, the famous Iranian Shahid kamikaze drones, which are extremely simple and easy to produce, cost between $20,000 and $50,000, while a single Patriot missile used to intercept them can cost up to $4 million. American equipment is also highly dependent on rare earth elements, and the only country capable of meeting US demand for such resources today is China. Well, Brazil has the second largest reserves, but it basically doesn't extract them. The process is very expensive, complex, and carries a high risk of environmental damage. There's no way around it. No other country produces as much as China. They control 90% of global rare earth processing. Without those materials, advanced weapons simply don't function.
The problem? China has imposed sanctions on the rare earths exports to the US in retaliation for tariffs. directly harming America's arms industry.
If that weren't enough, a significant portion of the US arsenal has already been expended in the war in Ukraine and cannot be replenished anytime soon, nor in the necessary quantities. In just the first days of this conflict, the US and Gulf allies used more Patriot missiles than Ukraine received during the entire first year of its war. I think the best comparison we can make on this topic is between the legendary German Tiger and the Soviet T-34s. It is undeniable that the Tiger was a marvel of engineering, state-of-the-art.
It was also extremely expensive, difficult, slow, and complex to produce. When they broke down in combat, it was practically impossible to repair it.
The T-34s, on the other hand, were simple, cheap, could be mass-produced, and were easily repairable.
Now, we know what the outcome of that war was. Remember, war is also logistics, and as they say, quantity has a quality of its own.
Another operational weakness the American faces lies in the effectiveness of their bombing campaigns. For an aircraft carrier to operate safely, it must remain at a great distance from the enemy, well beyond the range of drones and missiles.
What's the problem with that?
The problem is that their fighter jets and bombers will have to travel a greater distance to attack the enemy, and there is a major drawback to this.
Fuel is heavy.
Think about it. If you're close to the enemy, your planes will need less fuel, and therefore be able to carry more bombs. However, when you're a very long way away, you can't carry as many bombs because you need more fuel to get there.
It's like as if you have to carry a gallon of water from one place to another, but instead of taking everything into a bucket, you will need to make several trips taking one cup at a time. Efficiency is compromised.
But of course, even with these limitations, the US is still able to carry out devastating bombings. And yes, I know there are tanker plans, and they help mitigate this flaw to some extent. If you refuel along the way, you can carry more bombs, right? But there is a suspicion that even tanker planes have become targets, and recent events suggest that suspicion is justified. On March 12, 2026, a KC-135 stratotanker went down in western Iraq. All 6 crew members were killed. The Pentagon says it was an accident, possibly a collision with another tanker. But Iranian-backed militias in Iraq claim they shot it down, and the Iranian military is amplifying that claim.
Whether it was a missile or a mishap, the result is the same. Another tank gone, 6 more Americans dead.
Meanwhile, at Prince Sultan Air Base in Saudi Arabia, 5 more tankers were damaged by Iranian missiles while sitting on the ground. They're being repaired, but they're out of the fight for now. That's 6 tankers, critical assets that extended the range of every fighter and bomber in the region, and they're either gone or being repaired.
So remember what I just said about fuel being heavy and carriers being far away? Tankers were the workaround for this problem. Without them, the workaround doesn't work.
Since the 1979 Iranian Revolution, when the Shah fell and a regime hostile to Western interests rose in its place, the US has been trying to intervene and re-establish its influence in the country. In 1980, the United States launched an attempt to rescue American diplomats held hostage at the US Embassy in Tehran. Operation Eagle Claw, ordered by President Jimmy Carter, was a military disaster due to mechanical failures caused by a sandstorm. 8 American servicemen died in the operation, and their bodies were exposed by Tehran as a political propaganda. A humiliation that burned deep into the American psyche. The failure was so significant that it contributed to Carter's defeat by Ronald Reagan in the 1980 election. Years later, after 9/11, Iran was in the US crosshairs. In 2007, during a presidential campaign rally for then Senator John McCain in Murrells Inlet, South Carolina, a voter asked McCain when the US would send an air message to Iran. McCain responded jokingly, singing the chorus of the Beach Boys song Barbara Ann, but changing the lyrics to
The remark sparked international controversy and was used by critics to portray him as a war hawk, eager for a conflict with Tehran.
The fact is that Iran was officially included in the War on Terror plans when President George W. Bush labeled it, along with Iraq and North Korea, as part of the axis of evil. The US claimed that Iran was seeking weapons of mass destruction and supporting global terrorism. During the 2000s, the Pentagon even revealed several plans for an attack on Iran, such as Plan 8022, focused primarily on destroying nuclear facilities and Revolutionary Guard bases in the event that diplomacy failed. However, unlike Iraq or Afghanistan, a war with Iran was always seen as much riskier due to its mountainous terrain, well-organized armed forces, ability to close the Strait of Hormuz, and fear of retaliation by pro-Iranian groups such as Hezbollah or the Houthis, something we're seeing right now. Since a direct military confrontation was always seen as risky, another strategy had to be adopted.
For many years, the US has pursued the strategy of economically weakening Iran through sanctions.
There were two objectives. By targeting the economy, you indirectly weaken the adversary's military forces, making them vulnerable and easier to defeat. At the same time, economic crises generate widespread public dissatisfaction with the government and facilitate regime change. If you've been following the news in recent years, you've seen how many protests have taken place in Iran, often driven by this popular dissatisfaction with the economy.
So for the US, sanctions are a crucial tool in its plan for regime change. For the US, establishing a friendly government in Tehran is important for several reasons.
First, access to energy resources, oil. Second, preventing Iran from developing nuclear weapons and acquiring a nuclear deterrent. Third, ensuring they never again close the Strait of Hormuz and disrupt the global oil market. Fourth, distancing Iran from its current alignment with Russia and China and undermining Beijing's new Silk Roads. Fifth, weakening the so-called axis of resistance orchestrated by General Soleimani. There is also a religious dimension that some scholars argue shapes policy.
In certain American political circles, there is a theological belief that supporting Israel and conflicts in the Middle East is a way of fulfilling biblical prophecies. Whether you believe this or not, it's a factor that analysts take into consideration when trying to understand the full picture of America's foreign policy.
What about Israel? For Israel, Iran is considered its greatest enemy and an existential threat. Iran's doctrine of saturation attacks using missiles and drones is now a major problem for the country, capable of damaging its infrastructure. Furthermore, groups aligned with Iran such as Hezbollah, Hamas, and the Houthis pose a major risk not only to the country's population but also to its economy. Again, the Houthis' closure of the Red Sea had repercussions on the Israeli economy and ports. Moreover, there are geopolitical interests at stake. If Israel managed to defeat Iran and its proxies, it would consolidate its position in the region with virtually no enemies. This would allow it to position itself as a strategic partner to both the West and the East. For example, the Qatar gas pipeline could operate smoothly without the risk of sabotage by hostile militias, and Israel could assume Iran's leading role in the new Silk Roads.
So for them, it's a matter of survival and a long-term policy.
Iran has developed asymmetric warfare strategies that have proven to be very effective and have surprised the world.
But let's be reasonable, the US and Israel are not just sitting there taking hits. They have strengths, real ones.
2 carrier strike groups, over 100 stealth fighters, B-2 bombers waiting in the wings.
In the first week alone, they struck 2,000 targets. Missile launchers, command centers, radar installations, naval vessels.
Their strategies unfolded in phases. First, decapitation, taking out the leadership. Second, destroying Iran's ability to project power through missiles and drones. Third, systematic degradation of military infrastructure. Recently, while I was writing the script for this video, the US attacked Karg Island, a major oil terminal for the Iranian economy that handles 90% of Iran's crude oil exports.
It's important to note that the US didn't attack the island's oil infrastructure, just the military installations located there, at least for now.
This could be used as a deterrent against Iran or as a leverage in future negotiations. Something like, okay, you have the Strait of Hormuz, but we have the heart of your economy. When we want to strike it, we will. Are you ready to talk?
It's a powerful card to play.
Besides, the US is talking to Kurdish opposition groups.
The idea? To arm them, train them, let them open a ground front in the western Iran.
Stretch Iranian forces, create a buffer, let Iran fight on multiple fronts while the bombing continues.
So yes, the US and Israel still have air superiority, carrier groups, strike volume, naval dominance, hard power. But even so, there are some flaws in their strategy.
First, as I said, saturation warfare has become a problem and it's becoming difficult to defend against swarms of drones and missiles. Second, there are operational issues such as the range of bombing missions, which limits the aircraft it's sufficient due to the weight of the fuel. Third, the Turks do not like the idea of arming Kurdish forces, as this could lead to Kurdish separatist movements within Turkey. It is worth remembering that Turkey is NATO's second largest military power after the US and holds a crucial geographical position. Fourth, the bombings end up affecting the Iranian civilian population and undermining their support for a potential regime change. In a way, it even gives more strength to the government, which would say, you see, this is what we were trying to avoid.
But the most important thing, it's what I said before, it's like a Hydra.
Decapitation alone would not bring about regime change, since there is an ideological component deeply rooted in much of the population. If a leader were to be overthrown, many potential replacements would emerge, perhaps even worse than the previous one. It would take boots on the ground to try to change that, and even then, it could go wrong in the end.
Look at the war in Afghanistan. For 20 years, the US fought to prevent the Taliban from coming to power, and in the end, the Taliban came to power. So we don't know who will win this war. Everything is still very unclear. The fact is that the situation seems evenly balanced, and it's been a long time since the United States faced a strong enemy like Iran. In just a few weeks, this conflict had just as much impact in the world as the Ukrainian war. Paradigms are being shattered in a matter of days, which is quite frightening. Unfortunately, war is part of the human nature, but it's a very sad thing, a very dark side of our nature.
We always think about the impact it has on both sides and on the families who lose their loved ones. I hope that at some point they will find a channel for lasting dialogue and diplomacy, and that things will be resolved rather than escalate.
Before we move on, there's one more question worth asking. It's a question that multiple news outlets are investigating. Did someone profit from knowing this war was coming?
Here's what we know. Blockchain analysis firms have identified some accounts that made a lot of money betting on the exact time of the strikes on Iran. These accounts were all created in February. They had no betting history, and they only placed bets on one thing: the exact timing of the US attack.
Now, I want to be clear, there's no proof that anyone in the government was involved. There's no evidence linking these bets to officials. But it does tell something important. Maybe someone knew.
And if someone in the betting world knew, where the maximum reward for a small player is a 6 times return, then what about the people who play where the real money moves, the big shots in the financial market? Here's the thing. Betting sites offer a multiplier effect. If you have $80,000 and you know something the market doesn't, you can turn into $500,000 overnight.
That's perfect for someone with good information but limited money.
But if you have real money, hundreds of millions, you don't go to betting sites. There's not enough liquidity, the market would move against you. Instead, you go where the big money plays. Oil futures, energy stocks, options contracts.
These accounts we know about suggest that advanced information existed.
What we don't know, and may never know, is how many others had that same information and where they choose to put their money.
So what does all this mean? Maybe someone knew what was coming. Small fishes and big fishes.
The small fishes used the bets, and there are some unusual evidences that suggest some people knew something. And if the small fishes in the betting world knew it, so did the megalodons of the financial market.
So, someone out there is probably making lots of money with this. But not we, the people.
We're the ones who pay for it, in the gas pumps, bills, groceries, jobs. And this reminds me of a quote from Gordon Gekko in the film Wall Street. The most valuable commodity that I know of is information.
Yeah, my friend. Maybe the world is a big casino and our politicians are the croupiers. For decades, Iran held a card that it never wanted to play, closing the Strait of Hormuz. It was the ultimate deterrent, a threat designed to make the world think twice before attacking. The message was simple: if you cross our red line, we'll cross yours.
And for a good reason. The Strait of Hormuz is not just another shipping lane, it's the aorta of the global economy. Every day, 20 million barrels of oil, roughly one-fifth of globally traded petroleum, normally passes through this narrow 33-kilometer channel. Also flowing through it, 23% of the world's ammonia, 34% of its urea, and most of the LNG that powers homes across Asia. Basically, the energy that drives the economy and fertilizers that are essential for our food supply. Closing it was always the nightmare scenario. As economist Maurice Obstfeld, former IMF chief economist, put it, for a long time the nightmare scenario that deterred the US from even thinking about an attack on Iran, and which got them to urge restraint on Israel, was that the Iranians would close the Strait of Hormuz. Now we're in the nightmare scenario. On February 28, 2026, the US and Israel crossed that line, and Iran played its card.
Now, when we say that Iran closed the strait, what does it mean actually? Iran didn't need to sink ships or lay mines everywhere, though they have that capability. No, they just had to make it uninsurable.
War risk insurance premiums for vessels in the Gulf have jumped between 300 and 500%. Shipping giants simply stopped transiting. By March 1st, the strait was effectively closed. Iran's Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi has been clear. The Strait of Hormuz is open. It is only closed to American and Israeli ships and tankers. Others are free to pass. But here's the catch. Of course, many of them prefer not to because of their security concerns.
In other words, technically open, functionally closed.
So, with insurance premiums rising, the world has been forced to seek alternative routes, extremely expensive and time-consuming ones, such as circumnavigating Africa via the Cape of Good Hope. This will cause an absurd spike in oil prices, and when oil prices rise, everything else goes up with them. It won't be just a price hike at the gas pump, but at the grocery store, your health insurance, your rent, your car tires, your online shopping, your restaurants on the weekends.
Everything will go up, and by a lot. As if that wasn't bad enough, the shortage of fertilizers, which are crucial for farming, would drive the prices of food even higher. It's a nightmare. Here's something the news won't tell you. The US didn't think this would happen.
According to CNN and multiple US media reports, national security officials did not sufficiently factor into their planning a worst-case scenario, where Iran would actually close the strait. The administration believed shutting it would hurt Iran more than the US.
A view reinforced by Iran not doing it before in previous strikes like the 12-day war in 2025.
When told of the risks the war could push up oil prices, President Trump downplayed the possibility, saying crippling the Iranian regime was more important. Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth admitted, "I can't say that we anticipated necessarily that's exactly how they would react, but we knew it was a possibility."
In other words, they didn't believe Iran had the courage to take such a bold and defiant stance.
But let's face it, when a country suffers an interference against its sovereignty that shortens the life of its leader and 150 schoolgirls,
all options are on the table.
So where do the Gulf monarchies stand in all of this? Put yourself in Riyadh again, or Abu Dhabi, or Doha. You're watching your entire economic model collapse in real time. Your food is imported and 70% of it passes through the Strait of Hormuz. Prices go up, after a few months shelves go empty. People won't be happy about that.
And then there's water. This is the true existential threat.
The Gulf states depend on desalination plants for drinking water. These plants are energy intensive, and they sit on the coastline within easy range of Iranian drones. A leaked 2008 US Embassy cable warned that if Riyadh's main desalination plant was seriously damaged, the city would have to evacuate within a week. Over 62 million GCC residents depend on desalination from 400 plus plants along the Gulf Coast. All of them are in range.
Okay, my friend, with everything we've discussed so far, I think you now have a better understanding of the big picture of what's going on. I know, it's a lot of information. But basically, what's important to understand so far is that, first, this is a clash of titans and nothing is certain. It's an evenly matched fight. Second, the petrodollar is the foundation of America's exorbitant privilege and therefore of American prosperity. If it falls, so does the American wealth. Okay, now we arrive at the main point this entire video has been building toward. The petrodollar system was built on a simple bargain. America protects the Gulf oil and the world pays in dollars. The Gulf states recycle those dollars into US Treasury bonds, financing America's debt and keeping interest rates low. That bargain now is under direct assault.
According to a CNN report cited by the Hindustan Times, Iran is considering allowing a limited number of oil tankers through the strait, provided that the oil is traded in Chinese yuan.
The Strait of Hormuz, the world's main oil artery, could someday become a yuan zone.
Like I said, Iranian Foreign Minister Abqaiq confirmed that the strait is open to everyone except US and Israeli vessels.
But if the only ships moving are yuan denominated, the message is clear. The dollar's monopoly over the Gulf oil is ending. Here's a dynamic rarely discussed.
Gulf sovereign wealth funds, Saudi's PIF, Abu Dhabi's Investment Authority, Qatar Investment Authority, collectively manage over $2 trillion in global assets. A significant portion sits in illiquid investments, private equity, infrastructure, real assets.
When these countries need cash to pay for food, water, and reconstruction, they sell from their liquid sleeve. US Treasuries and American stocks. What does that mean? If the war threatens Gulf survival, they sell treasuries.
US financial costs would then rise and US economy weakens. Dollar would weaken. If so, then the Gulf has even more reasons to diversify away from dollar assets.
You got the idea?
Meanwhile, the infrastructure for a post-dollar world is already built. Project M-Bridge, a digital payment platform developed by China, the UAE, Thailand, and Hong Kong, has settled over $55 billion in cross-border transactions without touching SWIFT. Saudi Arabia joined M-Bridge in 2024.
So as you see, the decline of the petrodollar had already been underway for some time. Maybe the current crisis in Iran has only accelerated the process. How will all this end? No one knows. This is a balanced, complex, and unpredictable conflict. There are many interests at stake. What we know for sure is that the world will never be the same after this watershed moment, or rather this oil shed moment.
Power dynamics and paradigms are shifting constantly on the geopolitical chessboard, and whoever wins this war will win it all.
And who pays the price for the war? We, the people. We who reap the consequence of our so-called leaders' poor choices.
Every time we look at a gas pump or a price tag at the grocery store. And above all, the families of the victims on both sides, whose loved ones had their lives cut short by a war that should never have happened.
Okay, my friend, this is it for today. This is my second video, but the first I'm recording myself, so please forgive me. And if you enjoyed and you're still here so far, I hope you can leave a like, subscribe, and all of that. And thank you very much, and I see you on the next one.